Good morning, class. Today, the class covers Chapter 11 of the textbook. The topic is development policy making and the roles of market, state, and civil society. This chapter looks at the effects of large, locally owned domestic firms in emerging economies as part of the private sector in developing countries. In this edition, some of the discussion on the roles and limitations of markets have been removed. Economic planning is defined as an attempt by the government to coordinate economic decision-making and influence economic outcomes. An economic plan is defined as a set of quantitative economic targets to be reached by a certain date. In the past, most developing countries adopted some degree of economic planning. In sum, the text emphasizes the need for both a public and private sector and the need for these sectors to cooperate in areas where government can best play a role, and in areas the private market should be left unencumbered. South Korea and Taiwan are cited as examples of successful proactive government industrial policy. We are in exciting, challenging, frightening times, global health, development, and the stuff of innovation. This video is a part of Harold Mitchell Development Policy Annual Lecture Series, of which this is the fourth, has been created to provide a forum at which the most pressing development issues can be addressed by the best minds and most influential practitioners of our time. Due to length of the video, I divided the lecture in two parts. We watch the second part today.
Thanks so much, Mark. That was tremendous. And you have also very generously allowed ample time for questions. So we will, as we generally do, invite questions from you all. We'll ask you to identify yourself and, if you wish, also your affiliation. To help Mark, we'll take 2 or 3 questions together and then invite Mark to respond. So for those colleagues who are working the microphones, I'd ask you to move to the people that I'm indicating in order, and we'll take 2 or 3 questions and then go another round. Okay? So I'll invite our first question from the floor. Over here. Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Dybel. That was an excellent talk, and you've done some great work at the Global Fund. I'm Jane Van Vliet from DFAT. I actually used to manage our relationship with the Global Fund a little while ago. And I noticed when I was working on the Global Fund, there was a fair amount of criticism on the global stage about sectoral funds, and they're very focused and they don't help the countries more broadly. And I noticed you've been working on education in Africa and cross-sectoral work, and I was just wondering if you could reflect on that more broadly, how you're expanding your remit and how that fits into your funding model.
Many thanks. We have another question down here.
Hello, my name's Kerry Varney. I'm an academic here and I chair the Advocacy Subcommittee of the TB Forum. Thank you, Dr. Dybel, for the excellent presentation. I think, Dr. Dybel, you mentioned APLMA, the Asia Pacific Leader Malaria Alliance, and we've had a lot of advocacy and support for the HIV issue in the region. We've got less commitment for tuberculosis and particularly drug-resistant TB in the region, and I think a lot less political commitment even from our own government. So I'm just wondering what you would recommend we would do to increase that political commitment, particularly in the context of the End TB strategy. Thanks.
Thanks. We might start with those and then we'll move across the room. Mark.
Thank you. Both excellent questions. So if you go back to the founding documents of the Global Fund, it was HIV, TB, and malaria, but the health systems piece was always there. At the beginning, and the partnership piece, that's how we solve these problems, partnership, right? They were always there, but we didn't implement that way at the beginning, which is natural, and I understand that. We need to get going, we need to support countries, we need to see results to maintain the financing. I did the same thing in the bilateral program, but the reality is over time, partnerships are tough things, but you actually, it's much easier. You know, there's the African saying we always quote, if you want to go far, if you want to get somewhere fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And it's very true. It's very hard. It's a lot of work to do partnership. It's easier to just go in and run a program. And that's what we did historically in development. But when you bring everyone together, you start seeing really exciting things and sustainable long-term things. And so the ideas were always there, but our actions didn't necessarily fit with them. So our remit actually hasn't fundamentally changed. We've just shifted how we act on the ideas and brought the movement and the knowledge and the information that's come forward from implementing in countries and supporting countries to implement to change, which is how we got to the Sustainable Development Goals, because there was that recognition. The MDGs actually kind of pressed us to do that. The SDGs, we hope, will get us to do better. So there's a lot of debate in global health architecture and then development architecture of should we just start over, recreate something that makes sense philosophically and from an ideal perspective. I've actually pushed for that when I was an academic, and it's a great idea. It's a great idea. The problem is by the time we get around to it, development won't exist anymore. I mean, the political fights that are necessary for that are not worth it. What is worth it is partnering and supporting the countries. And that actually relates to the second question a bit on TB and how you support countries in different stages. At the beginning, you're a challenging operating environment. You have to invest heavily in health systems. And we know this. We've seen that. Or you're never going to get results in anything, HIV, TB, malaria, or anything, when you do a national response. You can do pilot projects, but you can't do a national response. As you move along the development continuum, hopefully in a direction, as you get close to self-sufficiency, and there are a few countries that are, even though they're not necessarily high income, we actually have started to see what some of those component pieces are. So how do we support them to build those so we can get there? And focusing on key effective populations is hugely important in upper middle income countries because it's very difficult for them to do it. And we've seen great success in some countries working in that really tough conversation to begin to change. So it really is how we partner with each other, and will we accept the Sustainable Development Goal approach of focusing on a person, not an issue, and supporting a country to progress in development, or will we not? We're trying to be proactive in how we act on the idea, and education and health and adolescent girls and young women is a great way to do it. But we also do nutrition, we also do in a lot of other areas. So I think it's incumbent on us, and I think an institution like this can really help create the ideas that will lead to the action, not of in best case scenario, how would we create a perfect architecture, but how do we create incentives and drive the change that's necessary. So TB is an interesting disease to me, and actually, I get in trouble for saying it, it infuriates me that we haven't ended tuberculosis, right? Imagine if we had curative therapy in 6 months for HIV. Do you think we'd be accepting a 1.5% decline in new infections in TB and HIV if we had curative therapy in 6 months? Now, it's tough to diagnose, and we need innovation on diagnostics, and we have to really reach into the community and do active case detection. We actually have to change the ideas we've had in the past for hospitalized care, for how we do directly observed therapy, for how we actually understand adherence, and this is true in HIV as well. Bring in the social sciences, get out. We have too many white doctors running around, to be honest. I'm one of them. We need to bring in people with ideas from other areas to help drive some of this. But a fundamental problem, and so the ideas need to shift, no question about it. But one of the issues is 70% of tuberculosis is in the BRICS. Mostly in India, China, South Africa, we have pretty substantial programs. 70%. Russia has one of the fastest growing rates, one of the fastest growing rates of drug resistance, as is true of Eastern Europe. That's a place to be doing massive program investments. which is why while we're at 70 to 80% of external financing for TB, 80% of financing comes from the countries themselves because of their economic status. So it really is about changing ideas and acting on them better and supporting countries in a way that is a partnership to help drive towards elimination of tuberculosis. And basically, if India and China don't move, and Indonesia increasingly, given their increased rate, we will not get there on tuberculosis. But we're not going to invest, billions of dollars in those countries. It would be inappropriate. They're in the wrong place on the development continuum, and it wouldn't be sustainable, and it wouldn't be the right approach. So then how do we do it? So I think the two questions are actually related, and they're excellent questions.
We'll take a couple more. Sir, over here, and then over here.
Thanks very much. I'm Michael Moore. I'm the CEO of the Public Health Association Australia and President-elect of the World Federation of Public Health Associations. I was very interested to see when you're talking about partnerships, the one example you gave of partnerships with industry was Coca-Cola. So I'm wondering where you draw the line in terms of working with industry. So you're prepared to work with Coca-Cola? Are you prepared to work with alcohol companies? Are you prepared to work with tobacco companies? And because these all have pluses and minuses in the system.
Thanks for your wonderful talk. I'm Archie Clements, the Director of the Research School of Population Health here at the ANU. My question's about what happens when these diseases start to go away, particularly malaria, which is one of my interests. The cost of maintaining freedom of disease and preventing resurgence is high, but the donor interest may not be there. What advice, or what are your sort of plans for when things like malaria do start to go away? Yeah, that's my question.
Sure. So, Michael, it's a good question, and it kind of gets back to the question on what's the perfect global health architecture. We can do whatever we want. People are going to buy what they want, and how you work with people is different. Anyone who wants to help, we want to work with. But we do have pretty strict conflict of interest policies. And that's one of the reasons, for example, putting things on Coca-Cola trucks was a bad idea to all of us, right? It's different if you embed them in the Ministry of Health and try to work on a supply chain that works. And then you work with them, you then have a conversation with them. Cigarettes, I actually think we should ban cigarettes and have, if we're going to do anything, have electronic cigarettes. But we don't work very much with cigarette companies that I'm aware of. We might. Alcohol companies we do work with, and again, because we have to. In sub-Saharan Africa, the alcohol companies own a lot of shebeens, the neighborhood places where people go to drink. If you don't do HIV prevention in those places, you can forget about having any impact on HIV. But at the same time, we work with governments like Botswana to actually have much more restrictive laws on alcohol and policing of alcohol, and work with the companies to make sure that they have those policies. You can have that conversation if you're working with them. You can't have the conversation if you're not working with them. And you can have it around health and their self-interest, that over time they're going to be dinosaurs. They're going to be out of business if they don't start shifting, and they need to engage in a different way. In a similar way, we can have a very different conversation with ministries of health, heads of state who we talk to, the faith community in countries with very restrictive laws around key affected populations, because we enter it from a health lens, and we can talk with them about their congregation and the health of their congregation. We can stop working with a faith community because they have bad policies on key affected populations. If we do, we won't be dealing with anyone. So we have a saying, well, we hardly invented it, but it's meet people where they are. And we'd all like to be pure people that did everything right and saintly, but chances are we're not going to do that. So how do we not let the perfect be the enemy of the good? And what ideas do we have that can solve these problems by triangulating them, by squaring circles? And to me, that's the exciting thing about, say, the pooled procurement mechanism and the online version we've created called wambo.com of it, because we challenged our team and said, how do you square the circle of building this pooled procurement mechanism that's global for a sustainable long-term approach if the countries are using an external source? So we created an online mechanism, that's priceline.com, that is now being adopted in countries and integrated into the software is being integrated into the national system, so they can participate in pooled procurement like you would on Priceline. That's how you square circles. So we need to square circles around some of these challenging issues. On malaria, it's true it's an infection basis. right? So we need to stop looking at things on per infection basis for impact if we want to end epidemics. And we have to look at the cost of ending an epidemic. It actually is expensive, but it's a lot more expensive if the malaria comes back. And we've learned this, right? So I think many of you have probably heard this. When the US president's malaria initiative was announced, I happened to be with the Minister of Health of Zanzibar not long after, and he's like, oh, eliminating malaria? That's easy, we've done it 3 times. So if you don't do the global approach, if you don't actually get to elimination, it's going to come back. To me, that comes back to ideas. How do you put forward the idea that if you don't get to elimination, it's going to come back? Do the costs, show the cost of drug resistance, and that you can't overcome drug resistance unless you eliminate. Have the ideas, show how you implement them, and really create those partnerships. So, you know, this region, and again, APLMA is doing a great job on it, the Asian Development Bank and ASEAN should just be putting more money into eliminating malaria. It's a massive economic drain in the country and in the region. And APLMA is helping drive that. We can play a role in that. It's about ideas and driving the ideas and convincing the heads of state and ministers of finance and others that this is what you need to do. And here, engaging the private sector is enormously helpful because they can go to the government and say, why am I going to invest in your country if malaria comes back? I'm not going to invest in a place if a third of the workforce is out during malaria season again with drug-resistant malaria. How do you engage the partners that are going to change that? And those are ideas, and you take those ideas and put them into action.
Over here, and then last question, over here. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Douglas Robertson from the ANU. What would you say to the funders, the state funders of research, in terms of the investments that they're making or should make in the 3 diseases and some of the challenges you mentioned about bringing in the social sciences?
Thank you. My name's Jane Haycock. I work for the Innovation Exchange at DFAT. I just wanted to bring you back to several of the points that you made. And you talk about the focus on people and inequality in the SDGs. And this really isn't a question about HIV and AIDS, TB and malaria, but it's more a question about people and how, from all your experiences of partnering with the private and the public sector and with countries, where do we look for true expertise in understanding people? So where do we look to understand expertise so we can get people to make better choices in their health-seeking behaviour or just in their lives, such that we're looking at a different disease burden, a different non-communicable disease burden into the future. So a question about people. Thank you.
So two additional great questions. We're not a research institution, but we're doing something that we hope will help drive this change, which is quality assurance. And it actually relates to the second question. It's actually happening in Northern Europe and in the United States by Kaiser Permanente, where you're looking at quality assurance. We're not a technical agency, and I can tell you part of the partnership is if we start inching into technical support, we get slapped pretty quickly, as we probably should, because there are technical. We have 2 long-term advisors in TB, 2 in HIV, and 2 in malaria. We should not be engaging. You know, that's part of the partnership. But quality assurance is different. And so we actually, what's been happening in healthcare in Northern Europe, and again, Kaiser in the United States, is to look to see where you're getting good outcome and bad outcome. And we tend to take a national look. But when you start digging below national, you can actually start seeing spots that are performing at over 90% in whatever you're looking at, adherence or something else. And you can find places that are performing at 3%, 5%. And then you get a national average of 30% or 50%. So by really getting the data on a site-specific level or program-specific level, and in Europe they've actually gone to provider-specific once they got past, and they see the same fluctuation in the same institutions with providers, then you start building in quality assurance. And those are ideas, and it's not research, but it's a way to really drive, and which gets to your question, who has the ideas, where are they coming from? They're almost always the community, whatever the community is. It's the community of practice of public health officials. It's the community of practice of community healthcare workers. If you show them a problem and have the data, we almost always find them solving it on their own. But they have to have the data. So one of the responses to Ebola and we're somewhat engaged in this, is build surveillance systems. I'm a huge fan of surveillance systems. We need surveillance systems. But surveillance isn't going to end an epidemic. And if you're waiting for a community healthcare worker to report to its supervisor, to its supervisor, to its supervisor, to its supervisor, to have a head of state look at it, to go to an international organization, before you make a decision and go back down the chain, you will have lost control of almost every epidemic. So what you really want to do is build data management systems, not surveillance systems, that create the data in each environment, including from the community healthcare worker to the national decision maker, that allows them to look at the data and make decisions and bring them together as communities of practice. And those communities of practice have been shown to find solutions and share them with each other. So they find a solution and then start sharing it around. Ethiopia's done this, Rwanda's done this, Nigeria, interestingly enough, is looking at it. But you have to change people's mind. It comes back to ideas, and data drive a lot of those ideas. So show the data on where you have most healthcare workers don't particularly want to provide bad healthcare. But they need to have the data, and if all they're doing is reporting, they're bored doing it, they're not interested in doing it, and they're not thinking about how to respond, so that when the next bad thing happens, they're not going to respond. But if they're looking for fever and thinking about and have data on the number of people with fever in their environment, and you create the data, whatever it is, and it doesn't have to be computers. It can be a lot of different things. What we've seen is you can reduce, you can improve impact and value for money significantly. So communities of practice, whatever those communities of practice are, come up with the ideas, then we have to have the guts to support them and solve them. And that's where that idea to implementation is so important. So I come back to Harold Mitchell, who's one of the people who funds ideas to action, and without people like him, and without people like you to do the work, we would never get there. But again, working together, we will bend that arc of history towards justice. So thank you for all the work, and thank you for having me.
Thank you so very much, Mark. I'm going to give the floor now to Stephanie Copus-Campbell to make a formal vote of thanks. Stephanie is a director and the former CEO of the Harold Mitchell Foundation. She's also closely linked to the Global Fund as the director of the Oil Search Foundation, and she's a very good friend of ANU and so a very appropriate person to close. Before she does, I would also like to invite you to stay for more conversation and questions. It's not quite a shebeen, but we do have drinks to follow. Thanks, Stephanie.
Thank you, and I'm losing my voice, so I'll be short. I am giving this vote of thanks with 3 different hats on tonight, and the first is as the director on the board of the Harold Mitchell Foundation, and I can't pass the opportunity to recognise Harold and everything that he does. And Mark, you said it's rare to find a philanthropist in Australia. It's a heck of a lot rarer to find a philanthropist who gives into our region. And as you were speaking, you touched on a number of points that I thought, Harold's involved in that, and he's involved in that. So he's been funding John Thwaites and Monash University to lead our region in developing the Sustainable Development Goals. And in fact, we just met with Jeffrey Sachs in New York not too long ago. He's been an active funder for programs in Papua New Guinea, from snake bite to gender-based violence, through some incredible work that Stephen and others are involved in, to literacy programs in Papua New Guinea. He's been a personal mentor to Shanana Guzmão, who was Prime Minister and again funded a number of really important programs in Timor, and he's chair of the Australian Indonesia Centre, and that's just what he does in the region. The list can go on for what he does for Australia. And of course, Harold's been a proud supporter of the Development Policy Centre, so I want to, in this vote of thanks, to recognise and to thank Harold, who is, I'm proud to call both a mentor and also a dear friend. So thank you, Harold. I do remember when Stephen came to see Harold 4 years ago, and I was in that meeting, and Harold said, Stephen, I will fund you on one condition, and that is that you become the very best in what you do in the entire world. And Stephen, you looked a little bit daunted by that, I have to say. And maybe quietly confident. You knew you had it. You knew you had the formula and there was a need for it. But I have to say, again, we were in New York recently and I heard from colleagues at UNICEF that they get their information on the Pacific through the Development Policy Centre. Heard similarly from colleagues in Geneva. They get their information on the Pacific and our region from the Development Policy Centre. I heard from someone in a little community in Papua New Guinea the other day that they were reading your blog at the Development Policy Centre. So you are making a worldwide impact, and that performance indicator that Harold set for you, you're certainly well on your way. And again, thank you for everything that you do for development and also in our region. It's noted and appreciated. So the second... The second hat I wear today is my current job as a director on the board of the Oil Search Foundation. Oil Search is the largest company in Papua New Guinea, and we have a fairly comprehensive foundation funding programs in women's empowerment, health and education, and we are a principal recipient for Global Fund implementing programs in HIV. And if I could recognise Lady Roz here tonight as well, who has been an absolute champion for all things HIV and now malaria and TB, as well as other things in PNG. And again, it's a pleasure to have you here tonight, and thank you for all of your amazing work, and we can definitely recognise Roz tonight. And as Mark was talking, I was reflecting on how far we've come in the region and in particular in PNG on these three diseases. I think collectively the region has made real headway in malaria. We can't take our eye off that ball, but I was reading the other day that malaria rates for under 5 have decreased in Papua New Guinea from 24% to 3%, and that's an absolute achievement, absolute achievement. HIV, we've also come a heck of a long way. I remember when I started working in PNG in the year 2000, it was a doomsday scenario. It was going to be an African-like scenario. PNG had all the risk factors. And through the work of Lady Roz and many, many partners in Papua New Guinea through a multi-sectoral approach, as Mark mentioned, that has not come to play. But again, we cannot take our eye off that ball, and gender-based violence is one of many things that could prevent us from achieving our goals, and gender-based violence in Papua New Guinea is a particular challenge and something that multi-sectorally we all need to help to change. TB, I think, is still an absolute challenge. Last week I was in Gulf Province, which is right next to Western Province. So many people have heard of Western Province, not so much about poor little forgotten Gulf. I was in Kakori, at Kakori Hospital, a little district in Gulf Province. Their beds are overflowing with TB patients. 60 out of 80 of their beds had TB cases, and many, many, many people aren't even accessing medical care. When they do start treatment, they're off of it pretty quickly because of all the challenges to stay on treatment in Papua New Guinea and in a really remote part of PNG Gulf. And I can tell you that multi-drug resistant tuberculosis is right throughout Gulf Province, it's right throughout Papua New Guinea, and it is on the increase. And again, this is something, it is a call to action for Australia. Multi-drug resistant, extreme drug resistant, and TB in our region is here, and it is scary. And I have seen that firsthand just last week. So for our DFAT colleagues and others, you know, we do need to continue to get that message across. But Mark, you inspire me tonight, and I think the words that really made me excited, it is partnership, it's multi-sectoral approach, it's innovation, it's ideas, it's equality and gender equality being so important. These are the call to action for change and to change the world, and together we can do great things when those elements are there. So thank you for reminding us of that. And I guess with the third hat on I have tonight is someone who is incredibly passionate about development in our region, and development in particular in Papua New Guinea, which is kind of the country for me. I say to people, about 20 years ago I fell in love with Papua New Guinea, and I've been faithful ever since. But thank you for everything the Global Fund does in PNG and the region. You are making a real difference, and we look forward to our partnership with you for years to come. Thank you.